On the night of July 9, 1943, a Canadian artillery battery on the southern coast of Sicily fired 340 rounds in 4 hours in support of the Allied landing that would eventually push Germany out of Italy entirely. Every single one of those shells had been manufactured in Hamilton, Ontario. Not some of them, every one. The casing had been pressed, measured, inspected, and passed by women working a night shift at the Stelco plant on a production line that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and had not stopped since 1941. The gunners in Sicily did not know this. They knew the shells worked because the shells worked, and in battle that is the only thing you need to know about a shell. But the hands that made it possible were not in Sicily. They were in Hamilton, in a factory that smelled of metal and heat, on a line running through the Canadian night while the men on the other side of the ocean were doing what the history books would later decide was the real story of the war. This is the other story, the one that made the first one possible. Canada in 1939 was a country of 11 million people, with a peacetime industrial economy that had never been asked to do what it was about to be asked to do. When the government declared war on Germany on September 10th, the military requirement was immediate and enormous, and the industrial capacity to meet it was not yet there. The male workforce was disappearing into uniform at a rate the factories could not replace fast enough from the remaining pool of civilian men. By 1941, the arithmetic said one thing clearly. The other half of the workforce was going to have to do work it had never been asked to do, at a scale that had never been attempted, starting immediately. What happened when the recruitment offices opened to women was not reluctant compliance, it was a flood. Women who had looked at the arithmetic themselves and understood that the country needed them and that the door was open for the first time and that the time to walk through it was now before anyone changed their mind. Dorothy Malone was 31 years old with 2 children and no industrial experience when she arrived at the Stelco employment office 3 weeks after her husband enlisted in the summer of 1940. The man behind the desk told her Stelco was hiring. She was at the gate at 5:45 Monday morning. The foreman who met her group looked at the 12 women standing in front of him with the expression of a man waiting to be proven wrong. Dorothy went to the shell casing line and spent the first week making every mistake there was to make. Too slow, wrong grip, no feel for the rhythm that lived in the hands, not the head. By the end of the second week, she was no longer the slowest person on the line. By the end of the second month, she understood what she was making well enough to understand where it was going, into artillery batteries in North Africa, and then Italy, and then France, into the hands of Canadian gunners who would fire them at targets they could see and never think about the hands that had made the firing possible. She thought about it every day because the thinking made the work mean what it actually meant. Every casing that passed inspection was a round that would fire when it was supposed to fire. Every round that fired correctly was a Canadian soldier still alive at the end of that minute because the artillery had done its job, because the people who made it had done theirs. Dorothy did her job correctly every day for 4 years. So did 440,000 other Canadian women. By 1943, Canada had become the 4th largest producer of war materials among the Allied nations, behind only the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. A country of 11 million people outproducing every occupied nation in Europe and every Allied nation in Asia. Canada manufactured 800,000 military vehicles during the war, more than any Allied nation except the United States. It built 16,000 aircraft. It launched 244 fighting ships from yards that had been building fishing boats 4 years earlier. It produced 1.7 million artillery shells per month by 1943. The men who fired those shells and flew those aircraft and sailed those ships were the visible army, the one that received the monuments and the parades. The women who built the weapons were the other army, the larger one, the one without which the visible army would have run out of ammunition somewhere in Italy in 1943, and the war would have gone differently in ways that are not pleasant to calculate. Dorothy Malone walked out through the Stelco gate for the last time in September 1945 and understood that what was ending was not just a job. She had made the shells that went to Sicily and Ortona and the Scheldt and the Rhineland. She had met her quota every day for 2 years as a floor supervisor responsible for 22 workers and a production line that fed directly into battles she followed in the newspapers with the attention of someone who has a personal stake in the outcome, because the outcome is partly made of something her hands touched. She walked out into the September morning and did not look back, because looking back was not going to change what was behind her. The war she had fought for 4 years from inside a factory in Ontario was over, and nobody was going to give her a parade, and she had known that since 1941, and shown up every morning anyway, because the shells needed to be made, and she was one of the people who knew how to make them, and that had always been reason enough. In the autumn of 1942, a Lancaster bomber of 419 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, crossed the Dutch coast at 20,000 feet on its way to a target in the Ruhr Valley. The pilot was 23 years old and from Saskatchewan. The navigator was from New Brunswick. The bomb aimer was from Montreal. Inside the instrument panel in front of the pilot, behind the altimeter and the airspeed indicator and the gyroscopic compass that kept the aircraft oriented in total darkness over enemy territory, were components manufactured to a tolerance of less than 1 millimeter by a woman in Hamilton, Ontario, who had never seen the inside of an aircraft and whose name nobody on that crew would ever know. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was 26 years old, had been a seamstress before the war, and had a rejection rate on her components of less than 0.5% in an industry where 4% was considered acceptable. The Lancaster crossed the Ruhr and released its bombs and turned for home, and the gyroscopic compass held its heading through cloud and darkness and brought the crew back to the airfield in Yorkshire at 4 in the morning. Ruth was already at her station in Hamilton when they landed. She did not know they had made it. She came back the next morning anyway and made the next set of components to the same standard, because that was the work, and the work did not pause for acknowledgement. Ruth learned about Dieppe on a Wednesday morning in August 1942 from a telegram that arrived while she was at work. Her husband Edward had gone ashore with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry at 6 in the morning on August 19th and had been killed within the first hour. She read the telegram in the foreman's office and sat there for 20 minutes, and then went back to the line because the line was running and her station needed her, and the Lancaster bombers did not stop needing gyroscopic components because Ruth Calloway's husband had been killed on a French beach. She came back the next morning. She came back every morning for 3 more years, and the coming back was not the suppression of feeling, but something more precise and more difficult. The decision made fresh each morning that the work was the thing she could control, and the work was connected directly to the war that had taken Edward, and that the best available response to the war taking Edward was to make the instruments that brought the bombers home, because somewhere in one of those bombers was a 23-year-old from Saskatchewan who had a family that was going to receive a different telegram if the compass failed over the Ruhr. She held that thought on the line every day like a second tool. It kept her hands steady. It kept her rejection rate below 0.5%. It kept the Lancasters flying. What Ruth represented was not exceptional. It was systemic. By 1943, the Royal Canadian Air Force was operating over Europe with instruments produced overwhelmingly by women recruited from backgrounds the industry had never considered. Seamstresses and clerks and teachers whose hands had aptitudes the factory system had not predicted because it had never thought to look at the people those hands belonged to. The British Air Ministry noted in a 1943 production assessment that Canadian instrument components were arriving with defect rates significantly below British domestic production standards. The why was on the factory floor in Hamilton and Toronto and Montreal, on lines run by women who had been doing precision work for 2 years and had gotten exceptionally good at it because the stakes were real, and the consequence of failure was a Lancaster that did not come home. Meanwhile, in the North Atlantic, German U-boats in 1942 alone sank 1,664 Allied ships, tonnage disappearing faster than Allied yards could replace it. The Canadian-built corvettes and destroyers entering service that year began closing that gap in a way that the strategic calculations in London and Washington depended on entirely. Every corvette that left a Canadian yard, every instrument that held its calibration over the Ruhr, every shell casing that did not fail in a Sicilian artillery battery traced back to the same source. The 440,000 women on the factory floors of a country of 11 million that had somehow become the fourth largest producer of war materials among all Allied nations, behind only the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. That number, fourth, is the number the history books forgot to explain. This is the explanation. Ruth did not know the full shape of what she was part of while she was part of it. She knew her components, her rejection rate, her daily quota. She knew the work mattered because the production numbers confirmed it, and because every morning when she came back through the gate, she made the same calculation about the 23-year-old from Saskatchewan and the compass over the Ruhr and arrived at the same answer. The war was too large and too immediate for her to see its full shape. She saw 6 feet in front of her and did what those 6 feet required. The Lancaster crossed the Ruhr. The compass held. The crew came home. Somewhere in Yorkshire, a young man from Saskatchewan walked away from his aircraft in the gray English morning and did not know that a woman in Hamilton had made that possible and was already at her station building the next one. Ruth went home that night to an apartment that had been quiet since August and made herself tea and sat at the table and did not think about the full shape of things, because the full shape of things was not something a person could hold and keep working at the same time. She thought about tomorrow's quota. She thought about the tolerance measurement on the batch she had finished that afternoon. She thought about whether she had the right. She decided she did. She came back in the morning.
In the summer of 1944, a government official in Ottawa named Walter Thompson wrote a memo that was classified for 30 years and that historians eventually found in the National Archives without anyone having made a particular effort to publicize its existence. The memo stated that Canadian war production had exceeded projected targets by 18% and that this excess was attributable primarily to the performance of female workers on precision and assembly lines, whose output per hour was running consistently above the male baseline established in 1939. He recommended that this fact be incorporated into public communications about the war effort. His superior wrote one word in the margin: no. The memo was filed. The fact disappeared into a cabinet. The women whose hands had produced the 18% came back the next morning and did it again because nobody had told them about the memo and the quota did not care about the margin note. The Battle of the Scheldt began in October 1944 and was one of the most brutal and least celebrated campaigns the Canadian Army fought in the entire war. The objective was the estuary of the Scheldt River in Belgium and the Netherlands, a landscape of flooded polders and dikes and mud so deep that men disappeared into it, all of it defended by German units ordered to hold at any cost because control of the Scheldt meant control of the port of Antwerp, and Antwerp meant the supply line that would determine whether the Allied advance into Germany could continue or stall and die in the autumn mud. The Canadians were given the job because nobody else wanted it, and because by 1944, the Canadian Army had a reputation for being given the jobs nobody else wanted, and for doing them. They fought through flooded fields and over dikes and through fortified villages for 6 weeks and took 6,367 casualties and opened the port, and the Allied advance continued, and Germany's western defense began its final collapse. Every artillery round fired in the Scheldt had come from a Canadian factory. Every vehicle that moved supplies across that flooded landscape had come from a Canadian factory. The women who made those shells did not know they were supplying the Scheldt specifically. They knew the line was running and the quota was real, and that somewhere on the other side of the ocean, the work was being used for something that mattered. That had always been enough to know. Dorothy Malone followed the Scheldt campaign in the Hamilton Spectator with the specific attention of someone who has a stake in the outcome that the newspaper does not know about and cannot print. She read the casualty figures and the place names and translated them in her mind into production numbers she knew by heart, the shell casings per shift, the vehicle components per day, the running total of what her line had put out since 1941, and understood in a way no official communication had ever confirmed that the connection between the factory floor and the flooded Belgian fields was direct and specific and real. She did not talk about this at home because Thomas was still overseas and the children were at school and the house was quiet in the evenings, and Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper and did the calculation alone. She had gotten used to carrying the weight of knowing without anyone to share it with. The war had required it, and she had complied, because the war's requirements and her own had aligned in a way she could not have predicted in 1940 when she had stood at the kitchen window watching Thomas walk down the path. Everything had changed. She had changed. She sat at the kitchen table in the autumn of 1944 and understood that the woman who had stood at that window and the woman sitting here now were not the same person, and that the distance between them had been built one production day at a time, and that no one outside the factory had any idea how far she had traveled. Ruth Calloway worked the overnight shift for 14 months in 1943 and 1944 and came home in the gray Hamilton warnings and slept 6 hours and came back. She tracked the air war in the newspapers with the same attention Dorothy brought to the ground war, reading the RCAF raid reports and the aircraft loss figures and doing her own calculation each morning, the one about the compass and the 23-year-old from Saskatchewan, updated with the previous night's numbers. Some mornings the numbers were very bad. On those mornings she went to her station and worked with particular care, as if the care she brought that morning could reach backward through time and change what the numbers said. It could not. She knew it could not. She brought the care anyway because it was the only thing available to her, and available was enough. The battle in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The production lines did not stop immediately because contracts ran on schedules, and the machinery of industrial war does not have an off switch. Dorothy was on the floor when the announcement came over the plant intercom, a voice reading the official statement in the flat tone of someone reading something they have been handed, and the line slowed and then stopped, and the women stood at their stations in the sudden quiet of a factory that had not been quiet in 4 years, and looked at each other and did not immediately know what to do with their faces. Some of them wept, some stood very still. Dorothy stood at her station with her hands at her sides and looked down the line at the women she had worked with for 4 years and thought about Sicily and Ortona and the Scheldt and the Rhineland and the Lancaster over the Ruhr and all the mornings Ruth had come back through the gate, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite grief and not quite relief, but held all three inside it, the way a shell casing holds the thing that makes it dangerous. The war was over. The line was quiet. She picked up her tools and began to clean her station because the station needed cleaning, and she was the person responsible for it, and some habits, once built, do not wait for the world to decide they are still necessary.
On September 3, 1945, the Steel Company of Canada sent a letter to 1,247 female employees informing them that their services would no longer be required effective the end of the month. The letter was 3 sentences long. It thanked them for their contribution to the war effort. It confirmed the severance amount. It wished them well in their future endeavors. There was no ceremony. No official acknowledgement of what those 1,247 women had produced in 4 years. No calculation of the total shell casings that had passed through their hands, which was in the millions, or of the battles those casings had supplied, or of the men who had come home from those battles because the artillery had worked when it was supposed to work. There was a severance amount, and a date, and 3 sentences, and that was the full measure of what the country had decided their service was worth recording. Across Canada that same month, in plants and factories and shipyards from Halifax to Vancouver, versions of the same letter were being delivered to women in numbers that added up to nearly 500,000 people losing their positions in the space of a few weeks. The largest coordinated workforce demobilization in Canadian history was conducted without a single parade. Gerald called Dorothy into the office on a Tuesday morning and told her to the surface of his desk rather than to her face that the men were coming back and the positions were being returned, and the company was grateful for everything the women had contributed. He used the word grateful twice. People who are genuinely grateful do not need to say the word twice in 3 sentences. Dorothy sat across from him and looked at the top of his head and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had run his production line for 2 years with a perfect quota record, that the shells her line produced had been fired in 4 separate campaigns on 2 continents, and that the men coming back to take her position would need months of retraining before they could run it at the standard she had maintained every single day. She said none of it because there was nothing to say that would change the answer. She thanked him, she stood up, she walked back through the floor for the last time, past the line, past the women receiving the same news in the same offices at the same moment, and out through the Stelco gate into the September morning. She stood on the pavement and let herself feel the full weight of it without looking away. 4 years. Every shell casing counted and inspected and passed. Sicily, Ortona, the Scheldt, the Rhineland. 22 workers on her line, and not one missed quota in 2 years. She stood there and let all of it be real and present and hers for one long moment on the pavement outside the gate, because once she walked away, it was going to have to become the past, and the past was not something she was ready to hand over yet. Then she walked away. She went home. She made dinner. The gate was behind her, and it was not going to open again, and she had known since May that this was coming, and had decided how she was going to carry it. She carried it. Ruth Calloway's dismissal came the same week. She had expected it and had spent the preceding months building a file, not a complaint because the legal framework did not exist in a form that would have made one viable, but a documented record. Production comparisons between female and male output on equivalent lines, the Walter Thompson memo, obtained through a contact in Ottawa with the understanding that the copy did not officially exist, the 1943 British Air Ministry assessment of Canadian component quality, rejection rate data from her own line against British domestic production standards, everything that demonstrated in the language institutions understand, which is numbers and documented evidence, that what the women had done was a military contribution of specific and measurable strategic value. She built it because she understood that the argument that could not be won in September 1945 could be won later if the evidence survived long enough to reach the right room. She was not optimistic about the timeline. She built it anyway, the way she had come back to the line every morning after Dieppe, because available was enough, and the work needed doing, and she was the person who knew how to do it. The official history of Canada's Second World War, published by the government in the 1950s and running to multiple volumes, contained less than 4 pages on female war workers. 4 pages. The Battle of the Scheldt alone received 60. The women who had run the most sophisticated precision manufacturing operations in Canadian industrial history were reclassified in the national statistics as housewives and dependents, their 4 years of skilled work removed from the economic record as if the production numbers had never existed. Dorothy read those volumes in the Hamilton Public Library in 1955 and found the 4 pages and sat with them for a long time,
reading them slowly and carefully, the way you read something when you are trying to understand not just what it says, but what the person who wrote it decided not to say and why. Then she closed the book and went home and called Ruth and told her what she had found. Ruth said she already knew. Ruth said that was why the file existed. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 4 pages. Ruth said, I know. I have been thinking about that since September. Outside the library window, the Hamilton afternoon was completely ordinary. The street and the cars and the people moving through their lives in a city that had spent 4 years producing the materials of a war and had quietly decided to remember the war without them. Dorothy and Ruth were not going to let that stand. They had not survived 4 years on a factory floor by waiting for someone else to decide the work was worth doing.
In 1960, a veteran of the Battle of the Scheldt named Douglas Patterson gave a speech at a regimental dinner in Hamilton in which he described the 6 weeks in the flooded polders of Belgium as the hardest thing he had ever done. At the end, someone asked what had made the difference, what had allowed the Canadian Army to do what it did in conditions that had broken other formations. Patterson thought for a moment. Then he said, "The equipment worked. Every time we needed it, the equipment worked." He did not elaborate. He did not know that 3 of the women who had made that equipment work were sitting in the same room. Dorothy Malone was at the table nearest the door. Ruth Calloway was beside her. Margaret Kowalski, who had shown Dorothy the grip on the second day of the shell casing line in 1940, without words and gone back to her own work, was sitting across from them both. None of the 3 said anything. They looked at each other in the particular way of people who share a fact the room does not know and will not know tonight, and then they looked back at Patterson and listened to the rest of what he had to say. Dorothy wrote about that moment in the testimony she kept in the box in the back of her bedroom closet. She wrote about it not as vindication, but as information, the confirmation of something she had known since 1941, but had never heard said out loud by the person on the other end of the supply chain. The equipment worked. That was all she had ever been trying to ensure. The fact that the man who said it did not know she was in the room was not a wound. It was a data point. It told her exactly how much work remained before the record was complete enough to matter. Ruth's file had grown by 1960 into something considerably larger than a file. Through her work in the labor movement, she had connected with women across the country who had kept their own records, their own production numbers, their own dismissal letters, their own testimonies from the factories and the farms and the shipyards. The network had no name and no official status, but it was real, and it was building something that Ruth understood with the cold clarity she had developed on the overnight shift in 1943 would eventually reach a critical mass. The academic world was beginning to take notice of women's labor history, and the records that Ruth and Dorothy and the women in the church halls had been preserving were the primary source material that historians needed and could not manufacture after the fact. Ruth had understood this since the beginning. She had built the file for a reader she had never met. By 1960, she believed that reader was closer than she had thought. Dorothy Malone died on a Wednesday morning in March 1974 in the Hamilton house where she had stood at the kitchen window in 1940 and watched Thomas walk down the path. Thomas found the box in the back of the bedroom closet 3 weeks later and sat at the kitchen table where they had failed to find the vocabulary in 1946 and read all 40 pages without stopping. He read about Sicily and the Scheldt and the Lancaster over the Ruhr and the grip Margaret had shown her on the second day and the 510 production days without a missed quota and Patterson's speech and the 3 women at the table nearest the door who had not said anything. He sat for a long time after he finished. Then he called Ruth. He told her he had read it. He said he wished he had read it while Dorothy was alive. Ruth said, "She knew you would have listened. She just did not know how to hand it to you yet." He said, "I would have listened." Ruth said, "I know. That was never the problem. The problem was that the world had not given her the language, and she ran out of time before it arrived." Susan Mann's book on Canadian women in the Second World War was published in 1981.
Ruth bought 4 copies the day it came out and sent one to Dorothy's daughter, Susan, who was 40 years old and working as an engineer in Toronto, a fact Dorothy would have understood completely and that Ruth understood without needing to say out loud. She kept 1 copy for herself and opened it to the footnotes in the 2nd chapter before anything else, because she knew what she was looking for. Her name was not there. Neither was Dorothy's. But the footnotes cited documents from a private collection donated to the University of Toronto archive in 1971, documents Ruth recognized because she had donated them herself. The file that had started in a Hamilton apartment in September 1945 with a rejection rate comparison and a copy of a memo that did not officially exist. The record had survived the distance. It had arrived in the room. It had been read by someone who understood what it meant and had built something lasting from it. Ruth sat by the window and held the book and did not weep because weeping was not the right response to the completion of something you had spent 35 years building. The right response was to sit quietly with it and then think about what came next. She sat quietly. Then she put the book on the shelf above her desk where she could see it from her chair, picked up the telephone, and called the next person on the list. The work was not finished. It only changed shape. She was still the person who knew how to do it. Available was still enough.